There are various factors in this world, in this life, that distinguishes men from one another. For example, humanity naturally divides by gender, by ethnicity, by geographic origin. For a people in any given nation, there are also social distinctions that within that nation serve to distinguish people from one another. It may be wealth, it may be education, it could be religious beliefs, it could be political views, it could be the social status which one achieves or fails to achieve within that given society. Nevertheless, there are two great equalizers in this life. The first, obviously, would be death. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19, God told Adam, "For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." Now, it is evident that this statement is not limited only to Adam. And Job points this out in Job chapter 30 and verse 23. "For I know that thou wilt bring me to death and to the house of all living." And so the Hebrews writer, also noting an appointment that man had with regards to death. In Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this the judgment. And so regardless of one's gender, regardless of one's education, regardless of wealth and social status, all men will one day die. Additionally, another commonality among humanity is suffering. All men, to some degree, some more than others, suffer. Job noted it this way in Job 14 verse 1. "Man that is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble." Now, a couple of questions here. Number one, why do we die? Number two, why do we suffer? Well, first of all, why do we die? Chiefly because it is appointed by God. Hebrews chapter 9:27, Genesis 3:19, Job 30 and verse 23. But also because of man's sin in the garden, Genesis chapter 3, man does not have access to the tree of life because of man's sin. God has taken the tree of life and removed it from the reach of man, Genesis 3 and verse 22. Furthermore, the bodies in which we live, the tabernacle of our spirits, this body was not meant to be immortal. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 42 through 44. So why do we die? Really, the long and short of it is because of a man's sin, there is no access to the tree of life. Therefore, there is a time appointed for death. But then the second question, why do we suffer? Well, let it be stated first and foremost and forever understood, God is not the cause of human suffering. God never has been the cause of human suffering. God is not today the cause of human suffering. Man's trials and man's tribulations did not originate with God. But the fact is, all of man's troubles arise with man. Now, is it within my power, since all of man's troubles arise with man, is it within my power to avoid all suffering? In other words, is all suffering inevitable? Well, not all suffering is inevitable. I suppose it is inevitable that man will endure some suffering. As much as is appointed unto man once to die, there are those in my family who will die before me. Therefore, I will suffer and grieve and mourn because of that. So all suffering is not inevitable, but not all suffering is necessary. So, how can we avoid unnecessary suffering in this life? That's what we will discuss for our time together. Now, here's how we're going to approach this study. First of all, in answering the question, why do we suffer, we're going to answer that from three different views, noting each one briefly. Then we will go to the book of Proverbs. a very practical book, perhaps the most practical book in all of inspiration. And we will see, following the wisdom of God, that we can avoid unnecessary suffering in this life. Now let's begin, first of all, asking, or rather answering the question, why do men suffer? Let's note briefly, number one, when we say why do men suffer, well, we may suffer simply because we live in a world where wickedness exists, where suffering exists. In other words, I may suffer at no fault of my own. I may be living justly. I may be living soberly, righteously, and godly, yet nevertheless suffer. Joseph is a perfect example of this. Genesis chapter 37, verses 15 through 28, we see that Joseph, because of his brother's envy, he suffered greatly. In Genesis 37, verse 20, we see that first they desired to kill him. But because of his brother Reuben, his life was saved, verses 21 and 22. Nevertheless, he was sold into Egyptian slavery, verse 28. And when in Egypt, because of the wickedness not of his brothers at this particular time, but because of a woman, because of Potiphar's wife, though Joseph was living righteously and conducting himself justly, Genesis 39 and verse 12, because of her lie, Genesis 39 and verse 17, he was cast into prison. And so Joseph suffered at no fault of his own, but because of the wickedness of others, because he lived in a world where wicked men exist and where suffering exists. Righteous men may suffer because of wicked men. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 11, Jesus did not say, watch, he did not say, blessed are ye if men shall revile you and persecute you, but blessed are ye when men shall revile and persecute you. The implication is, righteous man will at times suffer though righteous. So why do we suffer? Well, because we live in a world where suffering exists, because wicked men exist. Additionally, asking the question, why do we suffer? You know, man may suffer because he chooses not to obey God. Now, all who choose not to walk in the ways of God, ultimately, standing before God in judgment, will one day face those consequences. But also, while on this earth, man may suffer because of disobedience. Suffering is a byproduct of man choosing to not walk in the ways of God. Now let's consider one of the great characters of the Old Testament, King David. Consider David, of whom it is said, 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 5, David did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, and turned not aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, save only, notice the contrast, except only in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. Because of sin, because of immorality, because of adultery, because of conspiracy, because of deception, David suffered. Now, David's adultery with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 4. And his conspiracy that killed Uriah the Hittite, 2 Samuel 11, 5 through 25. These acts not only put David's soul in jeopardy, but they brought great physical grief and troubles for David from then on. In fact, 2 Samuel 12:10, when God said, the sword shall never depart from thine house because thou hast despised me and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife, that statement of God, that announcement, that's not so much a sentence for David's sin, but it's more of a revelation of the consequences of his sin because of his deceit, because of his conspiracy, because of his immorality. Now, in time, from 2 Samuel 13 on, we see that in time, David's son Absalom would himself engage in numerous conspiracies. Well, conspiracies of what? Well, 2 Samuel 13, 19 to 29, he conspired to have his brother killed. In 2 Samuel 15, 1 through 6, he conspired to turn the hearts of the people from his father, King David, to himself. In 2 Samuel 15, 7 through 12, we see that conspiracy led ultimately to David being taken from the throne. Absalom usurped the throne from his own father. In addition to this, David's grief intensified when Absalom was slaughtered with a sword, by spears, by the captain of David's army. 2 Samuel 18, 9 through 15, and 24 through 33. But David's suffering in the matter with Absalom was a byproduct of his own choice not to walk in the ways of God. So we see, first of all, men may suffer. It's not inevitable, but men may suffer because we simply live in a world where suffering exists because of wicked men. It's also the case that men may suffer even in this life. Ultimately, we will stand in judgment. But man may suffer in this life because he chooses not to walk in the ways of God. Another answer to this question, another possibility, why do men suffer, is because of poor choices. You know, a righteous man may be innocent of sin, but he may yet be regretful because of foolish decision, poor choices that he makes in this life. Now, one example to note. Genesis chapter 13, verses 8 through 13. And that is with Lot. Now in Genesis chapter 13, we learn that the herdsmen of Abraham and Lot, they strove together because there was not enough land for their flocks and herds. And so Abraham approaches Lot and says, "We be brethren, let there be no strife between us." And Abraham gives Lot the choice first. You choose where you'll go and I'll go the opposite way. And so Genesis 13 and verse 9, Abraham says, "The whole land is before thee." Verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes. We see that he pitches his tent, verse 12, towards Sodom. And apparently, ultimately, Lot, because of poor choice, Lot lost all that he had, escaping the judgment of God on Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain because of their wickedness and immorality, escaping only with 2 of his daughters, Genesis 19 and verse 30. And so mankind, we may suffer in this life not because of sin, not because of disobeying God, not because of the actions of another person, but simply because we make poor choices. Now, all of this being said, how can man avoid unnecessary sufferings in life? Well, we've noted certainties of life. We certainly can't avoid death because it's appointed unto man once to die. We cannot absolutely avoid all suffering, but unnecessary suffering by its very nature can be avoided. Now, the Bible, the Word of God, guides us practically. It guides us practically as much as spiritually. In fact, the book of Proverbs, the most practical book of inspiration, is a great guide for man today. Proverbs is as practical in its teaching as Psalms is devotional in its teaching. And the chief purpose of the book of Proverbs is to teach wisdom. In fact, the book of Proverbs, we'll find the word wisdom over 50 times throughout the entire book. Solomon teaches us in the Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 3, he teaches and admonishes us to receive the instruction of wisdom. In chapter 2 and verse 6, he says, "The Lord giveth wisdom." In chapter 3 and verse 13, "Happy is the man that findeth wisdom." In chapter 4 and verse 7, "Wisdom is the principal thing." He goes on further to say, really, if you go back to the first chapter, Proverbs 1:31, Solomon says, "Those who despise and refuse the wise counsel that is found in the Proverbs will eat the fruit of their own way." In other words, they will suffer unnecessarily. I want us to note a number of the Proverbs and see how we can avoid very practical lessons, how we can avoid unnecessary suffering in this life. All right, now, let's notice number 1, the choice or choosing a good work ethic over laziness. Now, we might not think about that with regards to suffering in this life, but a person who does not have a good work ethic, a person who is lazy, a person who is slothful, he can expect suffering. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 4, "He becometh poor that dealeth with a slack hand. But now notice the contrast. But the hand of the diligent maketh rich. It's not about being rich. It's not about being abundance in wealth. It's about provision. It's about having the basic necessities. It's about not suffering because I have these things that provide health for my body, that provide sustenance for my family. But he that becometh poor, or he will becometh poor, that dealeth with a slack hand. Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 4. The soul of the sluggard desireth and hath nothing. The man who is a sluggard, a man who is slothful, a man who does not work, a man who does not have a good work ethic. Well, what about it? He'll desire. I need clothes for my back. I don't have them. I desire them. I need a roof over my head because of inclement weather. I do not have it. Why? Because I can't provide for myself or for my family. Why? Because there is not a good work ethic in this man. Proverbs 21 verses 25 and 26. The desire of the slothful killeth him, for his hands refuse to labor. What's his desire? His desire is food. His desire is shelter, but he doesn't have it. And ultimately it'll bring about his demise because he refused to work. He doesn't have a good work ethic. Verse 26, he coveteth greedily all the day long. He covets, he desires those things that he can't have, but he doesn't have them. But now watch this. But the righteous, the one who does have a good work ethic, giveth and spareth not. In other words, he's got plenty and he has enough to spare. The man who does not have a good work ethic will die because of his lack. The man with a good work ethic has enough to eat and to provide for others. How many families suffer unnecessarily because a husband or a father doesn't have a good work ethic to provide for their family? And so, how do I avoid unnecessary suffering in this life? Choose a good, strong work ethic over slothfulness, laziness. Number 2, listen to wise counsel. Now, that sounds very simplistic. It sounds just, that's common sense, one might say. But how many poor decisions are made, bringing untold suffering on thousands because wise counsel was not first considered? How many individuals suffer for years because they refused wise counsel that was offered to them? Well, Proverbs 12 and verse 15. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes. The fool says, this looks right to me. There's no reason for me to consider anyone else. I'll just do what seems good. But, Proverbs 12:15, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. It may appear to be right, it may appear to be good, but what about those who have already walked this path? What about those who have an understanding and a knowledge of these things? Not necessarily spiritual in nature, it could be practical in nature. But if I listen to the wise counsel, I avoid unnecessary suffering that may come my way. Also, Proverbs 15 and verse 22, without counsel, purposes are disappointed. All right, notice that. Here's my purpose in life. Here's my purpose in the business world. Here's my purpose for my education, whatever the case may be. Practical things in life. But I do not seek counsel. Without counsel, purposes are disappointed. But in the multitude of counselors, they are established. Now look at a practical application. If someone purposes a particular goal in business, but he does not seek counsel, notice how many hundreds that may affect in that particular corporation because the business fails. If someone purposes and they're in government, but they do not consider a multitude of counselors, and it must be wise counsel, right? Proverbs 12 verse 15. Notice how those decisions, those choices will affect untold millions, perhaps, in a given nation, because a multitude of counselors are not established. And then the untold, unnecessary suffering. And so, how do we avoid unnecessary suffering? Listen to those who have knowledge that we do not, that they have gained perhaps from experience in life. Listen to wise counsel and follow that counsel. Number 3, just refrain from speaking. Just keep your mouth closed. Job really puts this in perspective. In Job chapter 5 and verse 27, Eliphaz, at the conclusion of his first speech, speaking for his friends, he says, "Lo, this, we have searched it." And so Eliphaz, the oldest of the men, apparently, speaking on behalf of Bildad and Zophar, having spoken, he believes, in great wisdom. He says, "Lo, this, we have searched it, so it is. Hear it, and know thou it for thy good." In other words, Job, listen to us, and it will be for your own good. But in Job chapter 13 and verse 5, Job says, "Oh, that you would altogether hold your peace. Bildad, it would be better. Eliphaz, it would be great. Zophar, it would benefit you to hold your peace, to keep your mouth closed, to be silent, to refrain from speaking." And then Job says, "And it should be your wisdom." You want to show wisdom? Just don't say anything. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19. "In the multitude of words there wanteth not sin," or sin is not lacking. "But he that refraineth his lips is wise." In other words, a person who doesn't speak is more wise than the one who keeps speaking. Now, here's an example of this proverb, telling a lie. Certainly, deceit, dishonesty, telling a lie is sinful. But I want you to notice how there is this multitude. There is not a lack of sin, but an increase of it. When a person tells a lie, in a very short period of time, they have to tell another lie to cover up the first lie. And then a third lie to cover up the second. And then a fourth to cover the third. But it would have been better never to have lied, obviously, but just to keep the mouth closed. All right? In the multitude of words, there's no lack of sin. But he that refraineth his lips is wise. Also, Proverbs 13 and verse 3. "He that keepeth his mouth keepeth his life." You know anyone who's ever put their life in jeopardy because they opened their mouth? Or put the life of others in jeopardy because they said something they shouldn't have? Again, Proverbs 13:3, "But he that openeth wide his lips shall have destruction." Proverbs 21 and verse 23 especially speaks to our thought. "Whoso keepeth his mouth and his tongue keepeth his soul from troubles." In other words, you can avoid a lot of suffering in this life that is unnecessary if you'll just keep your mouth and your tongue. Just keep your mouth closed. Have you ever said something that you regretted? Have you ever uttered words that turned to your own hurt? Have you ever said something and immediately, as soon as those words came out of your mouth, you thought to yourself, "I should not have said that"? Husbands, how many times maybe have we said something in a reply to our wives, and as soon as we said it, by the look on her face, we knew, if I hadn't have said that, I could avoid what I'm about to have to deal with. Very practically speaking, we can avoid unnecessary suffering in life if we'll just keep our mouth closed and our ears open. We'll learn more and we'll avoid suffering. Number 4, how to avoid unnecessary suffering in life? Well, here's one. Be charitable. Be magnanimous, big-hearted. Be very liberally spirited in helping others. Benevolence. Now, this is not buying favor. In other words, I'm not suggesting if you have wealth, give it to people to buy up, favor to avoid suffering. This is not about buying favor. It's sowing. When you sow good, it returns a bountiful harvest of good. But when you sow good sparingly, the harvest will be meager. Now, this is a practical lesson we learn in the Psalms, or rather the Proverbs. Proverbs 11:25. "The liberal soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered also himself." Proverbs 21:13. "Whoso stoppeth his ears at the cry of the poor, he also shall cry himself, but shall not be heard." Now you take these two proverbs together. A man who has and sees others in needs and provides in abundance, what about when that man falls on difficult times? All those who he has helped will gather together to help him. He is not helping for the purpose of being helped in return. What's the old adage? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about doing good because it is right to do good. And when a person unsparingly does good, is very liberal in helping others, if and when that person falls on difficult times, people will want to help. Proverbs 22:9 also speaks to this thought. He that hath a bountiful eye shall be blessed, for he giveth of his bread to the poor. A bountiful eye sees the wants and needs of others. The bountiful heart satisfies that need. We see this ultimately in Matthew chapter 25, 37 through 39. The good done bountifully on this earth at the judgment will serve us well. And so, to avoid unnecessary suffering in life, be very liberal in benevolence in helping others. Number 5, and this may be one of the greatest points that we'll consider. How do we avoid unnecessary suffering in life? Be very mindful of who you choose for a wife or for a husband, who you choose as a mate. A man once said, if you marry a child of the world, do not be surprised to realize that your father-in-law is the devil. You talk about suffering in life. When a person marries someone whose mind, whose focus, whose enjoyment, whose life is spent on things of this world, seeking pleasure in worldly things, your life will be filled with nothing but suffering. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 4. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Marry a virtuous woman, in other words, a godly woman. Proverbs 31 verses 10 through 12. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price, look at this, her price is far above rubies. Great treasures of this world are nothing in comparison to a godly, virtuous, spiritually minded wife. The heart, verse 11, the heart of her husband doth safely trust in her. Look at that. You don't have to worry. You don't have to wonder. So that he shall have no need of spoil. There will be no unnecessary suffering. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She will not be unfaithful to him. She will not be unloving and undevoted to his children. She will not be uncaring in his home. He will not endure unnecessary suffering because of a poor choice in a mate. And it applies the same of a woman finding a godly, spiritually minded man. How many people in this world suffer, unnecessarily mind you, because they chose a husband or a wife from the world, rather than one whose heart was set on spiritual endeavors and heavenly hopes. Violence in the home, unnecessary. Family whose basic needs are not met, that's unnecessary. Children who are neglected, children who are abandoned, this is unnecessary suffering. The husband and wife whose spouse is unfaithful to their marriage vows. These are unnecessary sufferings in life. Choose a godly, righteous, spiritually minded mate, and you will avoid so much suffering in this life. Number 6. Another way to avoid unnecessary suffering in this life, choice of friends. And we talked about your choice of your mate. You know, who you marry is the second greatest decision you'll make in this world. The greatest decision you'll make in this world is to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. But another very important decision in this life is who your friends are. Your choice of friends. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 19. He that goeth about as a talebearer revealeth secrets. Therefore meddleth not with him that flattereth with his lips. You have friends who, when you tell them something, they go and tell everybody else all of your problems, all of your woes, all of your misery. Choose wisely with your friends. Proverbs 22 verses 24 to 25. Make no friendship with an angry man. Do not make yourself friends to someone who is intemperate, someone who cannot control their emotions. Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man thou shalt not go. Now here's the reason why. Lest thou learn his ways and get a snare to thy soul. Let me tell you what. Proverbs 27:17, iron sharpeneth iron. So a man sharpeneth the counsel of his friends. And we use that from a positive standpoint. And we encourage young people and we encourage brethren. You associate yourself. You make friends with godly people. So that iron sharpening iron, the influence that they have on you will be for the good. I'm going to tell you something, friends. A negative, bad influence will sharpen someone to the bad, just as much as a good influence will sharpen someone to the good. Here's a biblical example, 2 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 3. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. And Jonadab was a very subtle man. And Amnon's friend, Jonadab, encouraged him to rape his own sister. And Amnon went with it. And ultimately, because of that, it cost him his life. His brother Absalom had him killed. Our choice of friends will either greatly increase or greatly decrease unnecessary suffering in life. Another thought, to avoid unnecessary suffering in life, give heed and consider situations before getting involved. Now, again, well, that's common sense. But not everybody follows that wisdom. Proverbs 14, verse 15. The simple believeth every word, but the prudent man looketh well to his goings. Proverbs 22 and verse 3. A prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself. A man of wisdom and understanding can see this is not going to turn out well. I'm going to remove myself from this situation. But the simple, the man who does not have that wisdom and understanding, that man who does not listen to wise counsel, he passes on and is punished. Listen, friends, we ought to give serious, thoughtful, prayerful consideration to a matter before getting involved. We hear often, get rich quick. There's no such thing as get rich quick. We hear make millions even without working. How many people hand over great sums of money, perhaps even emptying out their savings because they think it's going to be a great return? But they failed to consider. They failed to gain knowledge about the situation. They didn't give heed. They didn't consider the situation before being involved. Tell you what, friends, in Matthew chapter 16 and in Luke chapter 12, we see Jesus also speaks of the same wisdom. He says, take heed and beware. And so he also acknowledges giving heed, considering situations before getting involved, helps us to avoid unnecessary suffering. Our eighth thought as we come to the close to the end of our study. To avoid unnecessary suffering, practice good stewardship. Practice good stewardship with your money, with your possessions, with your time. Proverbs 21 and verse 17. He that loveth pleasure shall be a poor man. A man who loves pleasure, a man who has perhaps great prosperity, who has finances in abundance, who has time in abundance, but he loves pleasure, he wastes all of his time, he wastes all of his money on things of this life, much like the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15. He that loveth pleasure shall be a poor man. He that loveth wine and oil shall not be rich. Proverbs 21 and verse 20. There is treasure to be desired in oil in the dwelling of the wise. In other words, a man who is a good steward over his possessions, those things with which God has entrusted him in this life, he will have oil in his dwelling. But a foolish man spendeth it up. How many people in this world seek help for basic needs because they waste their time not working? They waste their money on things of this world. They have not planned, they have not budgeted, and so they unnecessarily suffer and are forced to beg. You want to avoid unnecessary suffering in this life? Practice good stewardship. And then finally, this closing thought. And this is wisdom and counsel that even Christ took up himself. To avoid unnecessary suffering in life, friends, just mind your own business. Just mind your own business. Proverbs 26 and verse 17, one of my favorite proverbs in all of the book. He that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him, in other words, a man who sticks his nose in other people's business, is like one that taketh a dog by the ears. Now, friend, go up to a strange dog. And go up to that dog and grab him by the ears. A dog that has never seen you before. A dog that you have never seen before. And you grab that dog by the ears and you just watch what happens. That's the picture of someone who gets involved in situations and circumstances, strife that doesn't belong to them. How many friendships have been destroyed because someone tried to get involved and help a situation when they didn't need to be involved at all because of meddling in another person's business? How many marriages perhaps even have been destroyed because someone got in, tinkering around, trying to help a situation. They didn't have any idea what was going on. Now, Jesus himself lived this very wisdom of minding your own business. Luke chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. It says, one of the company, so one of his disciples, said unto him, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. So apparently the father had died. One of the brothers, perhaps the younger, we don't know how many brothers there were, but one of the brothers comes to Christ and says, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Notice Jesus reply in verse 14, man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? In other words, I'm not touching that. I'm not getting involved in your strife. That strife doesn't belong to me. I'm not going to meddle with that. Avoiding unnecessary suffering in life. Friends, you want to avoid unnecessary suffering in life? Stay out of other people's business. Mind your own business. Take care wisely of your own affairs. There are simple principles throughout all of Scripture, but especially in the book of Proverbs, principles for us to live by that will help us to avoid unnecessary suffering. Are you making choices that cause you unnecessary suffering in this life? Following the wisdom of God, our lives will be better. Our lives will be better certainly spiritually, but also physically. Look, God desires for you to have a better life on earth. Consider all of the physical blessings that he has given us. Matthew chapter 5, 43 to 45. And he has revealed his wisdom for us in the Proverbs. We cannot absolutely avoid suffering in this life. But not all suffering, friend, is inevitable. Follow the wisdom of God. Your life will be greatly enriched and blessed.